Welcome to Classic Movie Club. I'm your host, Chad Knirk, the digital editor of Film Review. We've been celebrating cinema here at Film Review since 1944, just a few years before Christopher Lee's first film in 1948. Christopher Lee may have become famous for his iconic performance as a young, suave, debonair Dracula, but his work went far beyond the Hammer horror roles he's most often associated with. With a commanding voice, penetrating eyes, and his imposing height, 6 feet 5 inches, he often found himself cast as the villain, but like Vincent Price and his other horror contemporaries, the villains Lee played were often the most interesting and layered performance of the film. Later in life, following a long and expansive career that began with uncredited roles in the 40s, he was working with the biggest names in the industry and appearing in major film franchises like The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. He made 5 films with director Tim Burton and worked with Martin Scorsese on Hugo. Beyond his work on the screen, Lee led a fascinating life. He was born into the Italian aristocracy. Before his acting career, he served in the Royal Air Force, and the details of his military career are still shrouded in some secrecy. He wanted to be an opera singer, and later in life he released heavy metal albums, becoming the oldest person to have a top 20 hit on the Billboard music charts. His life's adventures list like fanciful yarns, but he often found himself encountering the unexpected, like being a witness to the last ever death by guillotine. His cousin was 007 creator Ian Fleming. He later appeared as Francisco Scaramanga in the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun. Decades before playing the wizard Saruman, Lee spent an evening in a pub with J.R.R. Tolkien. He performed with the classic cast of Saturday Night Live, and his neighbor was Boris Karloff. My guest today is Jon Spira, the writer-director of The Life and Deaths of Christopher Lee. His feature work includes the excellent documentaries Elstree 1976, about the actors behind the masks in the original Star Wars, and Hollywood Bulldogs, the rise and falls of the Great British Stuntman. His docu-series Reel Brittannia explores the history of British cinema, and now The Life and Deaths of Christopher Lee, a documentary that mixes traditional documentary filmmaking with animation and puppetry. An elaborate marionette, voiced by Peter Serafinowicz, brings Lee back from the dead to tell his own story. Archival materials further illustrate the tale, along with new exclusive interviews from filmmakers such as Peter Jackson, John Landis, Joe Dante, as well as Lee's niece, Dame Harriet Walter, Hammer actress Caroline Munro, and a great friend of Film Review, former Film Review contributor and film historian Jonathan Rigby, who worked closely with Lee in writing Christopher Lee, the Authorised Screen History. And in the course of making the film, Spira reviewed the family archive and met and interviewed Lee's closest friends and family, and has created an amusing, eclectic documentary revealing a complex, comprehensive portrait of a cinematic icon.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh my gosh, it's great chatting with you because you've been making some of the best and most interesting films about British filmmaking and British film culture. So it's a pleasure to chat.
Thank you so much. It's rare that anyone is like aware of my backstory.
Yeah. No, I've really enjoyed your films. Obviously, this one included, and I'm excited to talk about Christopher Lee. Documentaries strike me as one of the most difficult art forms because there's so many moving parts, things that are sort of beyond your control to a certain extent. Tell me about the journey of documenting Christopher Lee.
It's a really interesting question, which I don't often kind of look back and think of it in that kind of way. But
Mm.
I suppose the thing that I do differently, and when I say I'm always referring to me and my producer Hank Stars. We work very, very closely together. In publicity, the director's always going to be the person who gets the name checks and wants to be interviewed and stuff, and that's fine with Hank. But we're very much a 50-50 kind of partnership. And the thing about the way we work is that we're very open to the process. We're always really, really open to the process. It's kind of just like jumping off a cliff sometimes. It's not like we don't go in with a set idea of knowing exactly what we want the film to be or exactly what we're looking for. We usually have, at the point when we decide to make the film, it's because we're both passionate about the subject and because we've seen something in the subject which hooks us, which is not necessarily the kind of biographical part of it. None of my documentaries are kind of straightforward biographies in that kind of sense. So
Right.
for me, the starting point for this film was that I saw Christopher Lee's episode of This Is Your Life
Oh, yeah.
quite randomly, and it was a really fascinating watch because he seemed to not be enjoying it at all. He seemed to be
Right.
having a really horrible time, and it was really weird watching it. And at first, it was kind of amusing, and then I kind of felt awful for him because
Mm.
he really looked like he was having a bad time. Every time they did that thing where it's the mystery voice who's going to come through the door, he just looked panicked. And I kind of found out by the end. I mean, I watched it a few times in a row because it was so fascinating to see. And I kind of realized I had his autobiography, which I'd read maybe a year earlier at that point as well. And I kind of realized this is a guy who really has controlled his narrative for a really long time.
Mm.
And he came out of that era of cinema where, you had the studios were forcing narratives on you as well.
Mhm.
So it was really important to those kind of original set of film stars that they almost kept who they were very far back.
Mhm.
And there were some biographical truths to what they did, but generally, they were trying to kind of build their own protection, their own shell of who this film star was. And with him, it was to a really extreme degree. And when I started kind of reading about him and reading interviews with him, I I found out that it was just very apparent that he had a lot of insecurities.
Mm.
And that was the hook for the film for me, was I just thought, well, that's really interesting because Christopher Lee is this character in cinema who is a very kind of powerful, erudite, athletic, handsome. He exudes kind of power and class and aristocracy and things like that.
Yeah.
And the second I saw him as a kind of fragile human being, that's when I knew I wanted to make a film about him. That's when I was really interested. And really that's what the journey of the film was identifying those fragilities, those insecurities, identifying where they came from, how they manifested, and really trying to build an empathy for the audience with him. The journey was really, you try and find as many people who knew him as possible and set up interviews with them. And you keep those interviews as open ended as possible because you want to learn. A lot of people who make documentaries go into interviews with a set of questions, and they know
Mm.
what they want to get out of their subjects. They know the answers they want, and I never do that. So the journey was just enjoying learning about him and always building on this idea that we initially had about him as an insecure, very human kind of person. And then we had a kind of creative journey as well in terms of all the stuff with the puppet and the animation and all of that kind of thing. And yeah, that was almost a separate journey.
Right. How did you settle on the storytelling devices that you used, from the narration to the puppetry and all the different animation styles that you mentioned?
The original kind of concept, I guess, was that he had such a fascinating, not just a fascinating career, but really fascinating life. And he died in his 90s, and it struck me that as we were making it, the film was naturally kind of putting itself into chapters, and these chapters were all kind of different eras and different kind of parts of the world. It had a colorful feeling, it had a kind of patchwork feeling to me. So I thought it'd be really interesting to play with animation and to make each section feel different from the other ones. I mean, it's still a straightforward film in terms of a chronology and talking heads, but I really felt that like we could, instead of just using photos and just using archive material, it would be really interesting to just put the call out and find a bunch of different animators who used all different styles and look at their work and just say, okay, well, they would be good for this sequence, and this person would be good for that sequence, and let's see what they can bring to it. To my mind, it really worked, and
Yeah.
we got this kind of combination of people, from people who've literally just graduated from film school and from art school, doing kind of cutting edge stuff. We used some AI in there, which
Mm.
has been a little bit controversial.
Yeah.
But they were artists using AI, so I think that's very different from me just typing in, give me
Right.
a thing of this. They're using it as a tool within their animation, and if you've got an artistic point of view controlling that stuff, using it as a tool, it yields some really amazing results. Right up to Dave McKean, who's a very famous illustrator and filmmaker, and he did a whole section for us as well. He did the section where Christopher Lee's in hospital having surgery,
Right.
and so I love it. That was the choice, was that we would get as many different peoples in with as many different perspectives, and we would make all of these sections feel completely different. And then when it came to the puppets, I always wanted him telling his own story. I always wanted, because he cares about his story so much.
Right.
And like I say, he controls the narrative of his life so much, and he's such a strong character that I ended up writing a script from. I mean, it was just, oh my god, I had so much material. I mean, he's written several volumes of like his autobiography over the years.
Mm.
But I was working with the British Film Institute, and they gave me just piles of interviews with him. So I felt like I knew where he was coming from and what he wanted his story to be. His story was always stated very clearly. He very
Mm.
rarely contradicted himself.
Mm.
Um, so I thought what would be interesting was to have him narrate his own story, and then intercut that with talking heads with people who really knew him, friends and family, and people who worked with him. All of our interviewees had a strong personal relationship with him
Mm. Mhm.
live, and they kind of very gently contradict him. So you have him presenting his story as he would like it to be told,
Right.
and we give him like the decency of expressing it in the way I feel he would have expressed it. But we play that against clips of people who, in a very loving way, give you their take on what the actual truth of the matter is, and maybe why he felt certain ways and where he was coming from. Originally, I was inspired by a TV advert we had over here about 20 years ago, where there was this very famous comedian here called Bob Monkhouse. And I think 4 years after he died, he suddenly turned up on a TV advert, um,
Mm.
warning against prostate cancer, which is what he had died of.
Wow.
And it was quite early CG. So they had him in a graveyard cracking jokes over his own grave. And he gets onto the subject of prostate cancer, that men should go and get checked. It's on YouTube. It still looks really good. It's a really well made advert. And seeing that was a real inspiration. I kind of thought, well, I'd like to do that. I'd like to maybe we can use CG and get old footage of him and have him tell his story in graveyards or things like that. We do tests, and we try different things, and we bring different people in, and eventually it was obvious that wasn't really going to work the way we wanted it to. And at the point I had to make a decision, it just seemed a little controversial.
Mhm.
The tests weren't great. You can manipulate people's mouths all you want, but there's something behind the eyes, and there's something
Mhm.
in the way people express themselves with their eyebrows and all kinds of things, where I just felt it just wasn't 100% convincing. It wasn't right. So we kind of thought, well, what other options are there? And Hank was the one who came up with puppetry. And yeah, originally, I mean, we looked for a while at kind of this amazing guy who does kind of paper puppetry live. But then eventually we just thought marionettes. And we found this amazing guy, Andy Gent, who does all of Wes Anderson's puppets and all of Tim Burton's puppets. And we met him. He's such an amazing guy, lovely guy. We clicked so well with him that it was just like, yeah, of course we're going to work with him. And he built this stunning puppet. It cost a lot of money, um, and it took a lot of building. It's a lot less simple than it looks, but it's beautiful. It takes two people to operate it, and yeah, then we went and we shot for a few days. And yeah, I mean, people. It's interesting now because the reviews are coming out now, and it's in this country we have a thing which we call Do you know Marmite?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like Marmite is like a food here, which traditionally everyone either loves or hates. So you always talk about things having a Marmite response, and the puppet is definitely having a Marmite response. So you know,
Really?
people
Wow.
either love or they hate it, which is fine. I mean, you don't want people in the middle.
Yeah, that's true. I'm on the love it side. I really think
Oh,
it's,
right.
yeah, special. You mentioned the script, and I wanted to ask because you talked about the dynamic between the interviewees and Christopher's story. I think in order to create the spirit and cadence of Christopher Lee, you have to have a very well researched script, and it felt spot on. How did you go about that development process?
It was through immersing myself in in all the interviews with him, you know, video interviews and written interviews. And when you do that, after even a week, you can hear his voice in your head. You can hear how he phrases things, and you can and even you start to understand what his opinions on things are going to be. And
Hmm.
he kind of, you know, for a while he kind of I felt like he had real estate in my head for quite a while, and I would hear his voice, and there would be times where I'd be having a conversation with my wife, and I would want to answer as Christopher Lee because in my head I know how he would answer something. And the thing that's actually interesting is that actually to have used his real speech patterns, it would have been a nightmare because he was incredibly verbose
Hmm.
and he would never stay on subject with anything. So when you see interviews with him, he would be asked a question and he would go off subject in the first sentence, and then he would go off subject from the next sentence and the next, and he would like branch away from things. And he would do these very complicated, like when you see them actually written out, they're quite complicated, like this kind of branching thing that he would do, where he would, in the middle of a sentence, he would qualify it with another sentence, and then come back to the first sentence.
Hmm.
So I had to find a way of writing around that. Um,
Yeah.
but I did. I felt like I found his voice. And I got there fairly quickly. I'd started my career as a screenwriter, so I mean I've been a documentarian for my real career, but I still had the kind of I could tap into the ability to nail down a character and kind of get it on the page.
What was that like honing his life down into 2 hours?
It's a very natural process that just happens over the length of making a film. You know, it's just, you know, your first draft of the script is huge, and each draft you see the stuff that kind of falls away. Sometimes through consulting with other people, and sometimes you just fall out of love with certain bits of it. And then, you know, and then you film and you get into the edit, and your first cut is 4 hours long, and you just refine and refine and refine and refine. And it's a very natural process. It's something that it's hard to even kind of see it happening sometimes, but it feels organic. I've been doing this for quite a long time, but to me it's very instinctual. So I think when you first start making films, that people always use the phrase kind of killing your babies, which is you have to throw away your kind of favorite sequences. But once you've done that for a while, you realize that it's okay. Because when you're making a film, the things that you think are going to be the best things are when you get these really great kind of anecdotes from people in interviews. But you can't put a whole anecdote into a film. You can maybe get away
Mhm.
with one or two, but if they're talking for 3 minutes solid, it's not good cinema, you know. And what you realize is actually that what you're looking for is tiny moments, and the
Mhm.
moments that speak kind of volumes. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's an archival clip at the very end of the film, one that I
Yeah.
think you see, which is what everyone kind of comments on. For me, as soon as I found that clip, I was just like, well, I now I understand the whole film. Like the whole
Mhm.
film is getting there, and I know that
Mhm.
that clip is kind of the money, and I know that that clip is the thing that everyone is going to be fascinated by. I know that I can play probably 2 4 minutes of that clip because it's such
Yeah.
an electric
Yeah.
thing to see on screen. And so for me, it was kind of like it was very easy to get there. I always knew where I was heading. I knew that clip was going to be at the end, so I didn't have to worry. It's an organic, instinctive kind of honing down process. And I work with a great editor on this called Alex Barrett, who is so amenable and friendly and funny and got the project so well. When you work with people who care as much about the film as you do, it makes all the difference, you know. And
Mm.
you can trust them. You can trust the process, and everyone in the film becomes kind of an extension of you to some degree. You become one big organic horrible. That's a terrible sounding thing, but you become one big kind of organic being, and which this film is. I won't pursue this, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. What were some of the anecdotes or a story that you left on the cutting room floor?
we we had to cut an entire interview, which made me very sad. The biggest stuff that we cut out was to do with his music later on in his life. In fact, it's to do with music in general. Like music was a huge thing to him, and honestly, he would have rather have been an opera singer than a film star. And it bugged him his entire life. His entire life. He had one opportunity when he was younger to train, but he would have had to pay for his own accommodation or something. And at that time, he couldn't afford to do it. He couldn't do it. And a few years later, when he had some money, he decided he was going to be an opera singer. Basically, a doctor told him it was too late. His voice would never be where it needed to be, even though he was a great singer. So, although we talk about, we do reference it in the film, music was a much bigger thing to him than we probably make out in the film.
Mm,
And
mm.
when it came to quite late in life, in his 70s through to his 90s, music was a really big thing to him, and he really was trying to pursue that career. And we tell the story about the heavy metal side of things, but he had released some singles before that, which were more kind of middle of the road kind of stuff, which he'd done with this guy called Gary Curtis. And sadly, because everything they performed were these kind of amazing American standards, we just couldn't afford to
Ah,
get them. We couldn't
right.
them. And it got to a point where it's like, well, there's no point in talking about this if we can't show them performing these things together.
Mm.
So that kind of we lost Gary from the whole film, which I feel bad about because him and Gary were very close friends. And then when it came to the heavy metal stuff, it's a much bigger story than we tell. We tell the kind of nucleus of it, but the truth is that before he had his own heavy metal career, he guested on a bunch of other heavy metal projects with quite kind of big bands and stuff. So that was the bulk of what we lost. That was the bulk of what didn't make it in there. In terms of anecdotes, John Landis was full of anecdotes, and it's trying to with him. It's just trying to choose what everything he gives you is gold. So some stuff just fell by the wayside. It was a shame that we couldn't. One of the things we had to cut for time was the Gremlins 2 section, which was a real
Ah,
shame because Joe Dante is one of our interviewees and
right.
talks really well about their time together on Gremlins 2. And Gremlins 2 was also kind of the gateway film for his career beginning again. He had this late renaissance in his career when he was much older, where he suddenly was working with huge film directors. And
Mhm.
Gremlins 2 was really the first film which elevated him to that point. And we had to lose that section, which was a real shame. The thing is that like his life before he was a film actor was insane. Like he did so,
Yeah, yeah.
and you can't put it all in there. So because
Right.
when you're trying to make a film which has a point to it, it can't just be then he did this, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this. So the stuff that you tend to lose is the funny abstract stuff. Like he
Mm.
became a professional knife thrower. He was a lonely child, and he became obsessed with knives. And because he couldn't really relate to women or to girls at that point when he was a teenager, his way of kind of essentially chatting them up would be to stand them in front of a wooden door and throw knives at them. So we couldn't have that in there. There's a great anecdote in his autobiography about how he loses his virginity. And all I'll say is just read the book because it's one of the most hilariously written, wonderful, unexpected kind of stories. And we couldn't have that in there. He met he met the guys who killed Rasputin. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
there is so much with him. Really, what I hope is that when people watch the film, they'll then want to read his autobiography and want to find
Mm,
out, the missing information. I think what we've done is we've created a kind of emotional portrait of him, and I'm very
mm,
happy with it being that. That's all I intended it to be. I mean, maybe if you did a Netflix series, you could fit all of the facts in. But to be honest, I think that kind of thing when you're watching a film, it can be quite boring. You know, watching a film that doesn't have a point, that's not building towards something, which is just information, information, information. It's well, it's not for me. So it was never going to come out.
You missed the emotional story that you mentioned.
Yeah.
You're able to really capture in one take rather than having an audience have to come back from multiple episodes to get that overall picture.
I mean, I think that's the most. But for me, it's such a weird time to be making films because you know we've just entered. We're fairly new into it, but you know we're in the information age now. So actually,
Mhm.
there's no point. Like all the information is out there. Like if you want to know about Christopher Lee, you type it into Google, and it's there. You can read these articles, which are like 100 things you didn't know about Christopher Lee, which are mainly true. So it's kind of like for me, I'm like, well, what can I offer that's not that? There's no point in me spending 2 years of my life putting something together, which is just which someone could watch and go, oh, I knew that, you know, and
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and all of my films. I mean, it gets me into trouble kind of sometimes because I think people don't expect it with the subjects of my films, but all of my films are much more about emotions, much more about kind of feelings than they are about facts. Because I just think we live in an age where facts are just there. They're just, you know, and you'll know this as a journalist, but like when if you're going to interview someone, you know, you can research them and you'll realize that most of them will tell most famous people have like, you know, three anecdotes that they'll tell over and over again. And when you look at them on
Yeah.
YouTube, you're just watching the same interview over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
When you're making a film, you know, for me at least, I've got no interest in just treading over old ground. It's I'd rather
Mhm.
find something new. And what I find is that most people stick to facts rather than feelings. And actually, when
Mm.
you watch a film in the cinema, I think you're looking more for an emotional experience than a factual.
Mhm.
I think
Now that the doc is done, how do you view Christopher's legacy?
the thing that really struck me once I'd done all the research and really kind of was familiar with him was that he there's no one like him. There's
Mm.
no one in cinema history. Firstly, he made more films than anybody else. I think he used to claim it was a world record, and I don't know if it's a world record or not, but it's you know it's pushing 300 film appearances. Secondly, you know he started making films in you know the 40s, and he finished in the 2000s. So he
Yeah.
spanned almost 8 separate decades,
Yeah.
and he was something in all of those decades. He was relevant in some way in all of those decades. I don't think there's anyone else who you could say that about
Mm.
because, and especially the fact that at the end of his career, he was more successful than he had been at the beginning of his career.
Mhm.
So you've got this guy who's lived all these kind of different lives, and you know he came about in this era of cinema that I'm very interested in, which is you know British cinema of the kind of 1940s, and then in the 1950s, all of a sudden he's in the Hammer movies, which are their own kind of genre, that kind of lurid kind of horror. He becomes famous, and then in the 60s he's in Europe and he's working with Mario Bava and he's working with Jess Franco and all of these kind of very outlandish, rule breaking kind of filmmakers. In the 70s, he goes to Hollywood and he lives in Hollywood for a decade. In the 80s, he kind of comes back to London. And that's the point at which his career really looks like it's restricted to these kind of cameos and these kind of, you know, not very good films. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, he is working with Peter Jackson, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Tim Burton, you know, huge, huge directors and huge films. And you know, you can't underestimate the Lord of the Rings films and the Star Wars films are the biggest film franchises in the world and that's incredible. And to think that this guy started, I mean, you know, his earliest roles were uncredited roles, sword fighting with Errol Flynn, and at the
Yeah.
end, he's having a lightsaber battle with Yoda. You know,
Right.
it's crazy. So his legacy is huge, but it's also very split up. And what's incredible is he's a different person to everyone who loves him. He's a completely different person. And I, as someone who's in their kind of late 40s, I love the idea of someone who is in their teens or 20s and who just loves Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, watching it and going, "Oh my God, look, that's what he looked like when he was young, and he was Dracula, and he was Scaramanga in a James Bond film from a James Bond who I've never even watched a movie of." I think there's so much to discover, and I think when you if you grow to love him, which I think the film helps in a way, like I think then all of a sudden you can go, wow, there are all these films I can now go back and visit. And he did so many, horror was a thing, but he did so many genres and so many different crazy films. His legacy is almost 300 films, half of which are terrible, but always interesting. His legacy
Yeah.
is almost 300 interesting films.
Sir Christopher Lee, a film legend. By way of an Easter egg, or an appropriate Halloween equivalent, a deviled egg, if you will, in the same week I talked to Jon Spira, I also interviewed Dominic and Justin Hardy, sons of the Wicker Man director Robin Hardy, about their documentary, Children of the Wicker Man. Here's what Justin Hardy had to say about working with Christopher Lee.
I got to know Christopher pretty well. Partly the first film I ever made, called A Feast at Midnight, Christopher Lee was in that, and he wouldn't have done that if he hadn't done Wicker Man, so I'm very grateful to that. I'd worked with him a number of other times. He became a family friend, and I was one of the people that lobbied for him to get a knighthood. And when he got it, he never stopped bloody going on about it, so I wish I hadn't. I mean, he was, and it's really only fair to say he was one of the world's most annoying and boring men. His stories were legendary. They went on and on and on. And according to Woodward, Lee would literally turn up at any given scene and start telling a story about a golf course. So he had 18 holes to get through, which each one was elaborately described. And he could pick up the story at any moment. And wow. Edward Woodward was a bit more of an actor who needed to believe, needed to remember his lines, needed to get into the part. But Christopher wasn't like that. Christopher was a switch on, switch off. But, right. You asked how Christopher was. He was a very, very long-winded, self-styled storyteller. But, and Dad made this really clear, he was one of the most loyal men he ever worked with. And Christopher's loyalty was legendary. And his loyalty to the Wicker Man, the way that he kept pushing it, he originated it, he kept pushing it. He was in so many other films. Why on earth bother about this little indie quirky film? He did, and he did it to his dying day.
That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member of Classic Movie Club. Your support helps us produce a new episode each month and continue the legacy of film review. Don't forget to subscribe, like, review, and share the podcast with all your film friends. My thanks again to documentarian Jon Spira and his producing partner Hank Stars, and to filmmaker Justin Hardy. You can find more details about the life and deaths of Christopher Lee and Children of the Wicker Man in our show notes. We invite you back next month for another adventure, but until then, here's looking at you, kid.